Today we're going to be learning about the federal bureaucracy, always a fun subject for everyone. I guess as the first of your questions, what is the federal bureaucracy? The federal bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. It is responsible for implementing the policies of government. The executive branch is the enforcement branch of government and is the largest branch of government by far. It composes almost 3 million people. You can also see that the branch has grown tremendously through the years. You can certainly see the effect of the New Deal on this graph and chart when we tell you that the New Deal fundamentally changed the role of government and its interaction with the states and the American people. This is one of those things that we are talking about. And so as a result of the New Deal, in combination with Johnson's Great Society, you see a much larger, more energetic and activist federal government. And so one of the questions are, who are these federal bureaucrats and where can I find them? In fact, if we were going to do a scavenger hunt and say, find your nearest federal bureaucrat, I guess the question is, where would you go? And if you book a flight to Washington, D.C., you are going to lose. And so these federal bureaucrats are not just in Washington, D.C., although there is a high concentration of them there. They are actually throughout all of these states. If you were going to win the scavenger hunt, if you picked post office, you'd probably be the winner. But again, just realize that every single state has marshals, they have FBI agents, they've got IRS buildings, Social Security offices, members of the EPA. All of them are in every single one of the states. Especially in Arizona, you've got many people, the National Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, given that less than 50% of Arizona is actually Arizona. And so many of these bureaucrats make up the civil service. That is to say that they are hired. Before the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883, we used to have what was known as the spoil system. Oftentimes they were appointed by the president as a result not of their merit, but instead as a result of political patronage. In 1883, the Pendleton Civil Service Act effectively ended the spoil system. And so now, if you want to get a job in government, other than those very high level appointed positions, so cabinet positions or the heads of certain commissions, most positions are actually hired through the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, or they are hired through the Senior Executive Service. And again, the purpose of that is to try to remove the corruption in politics and to ensure that people are there based upon merit rather than other means. If you look at the demographic characteristics of the civil service, we did this for Congress. You will actually find that the civil service is much more representative of the American body as a whole than Congress. You'll also find that the number of people who, for example, have veteran status or disability status are actually overrepresented. And you'll also see that the age, though, is also older than Americans at large. But when you compare the demographics of the bureaucracy compared to that of Congress, you're going to see a much more representative political body. Here's what the formal organization of the federal bureaucracy looks like. We have 15 different departments, and then we actually have a slew of different independent agencies and government corporations. In fact, this list is not a comprehensive list, although it does include the Committee for Purchase for People who are Blind or Severely Disabled. So not one that you want to leave out. The goal of the federal bureaucracy is to create a top-down structure, and one in which you actually have accountability. Now, I know a lot of times when we think about bureaucracy, we don't necessarily, think about its design. Its design was to create a clear chain of demand, division of labor, and specialization, each with clear lines of authority. It was supposed to be goal-oriented. It's supposed to be impersonal, so people are actually treated fairly, and it's supposed to be productivity-based. And so that is the goal of the federal bureaucracy. The degree to which it actually fulfills that mission, it certainly can be questioned and evaluated. However, when you think about the implementation and the rulemaking process, you should not forget about iron triangles and the role of interest groups. You should not forget about issue networks, the role of media or academia. Also, because our government has grown large and complex, we're starting to see that the growth of the interagency councils. And so what you're finding is that in certain policy domains, not a single agency or department is actually in charge and has authority over that. And so what we have now are interagency councils that are designed to actually kind of coordinate the implementation of policy throughout the different agencies that might be responsible. But of course, creating an interagency council actually just adds another layer of the kind of federal bureaucracy. You're also starting to see an increasing complexity of policy domains. One of the difficulties of implementing policy is that your policies do not actually occur in a bubble, and they will touch many other, different policy domains. And so, what you might do in order to tackle crime might have knock-on effects on all sorts of different other policy domains, whether they might be, poverty, or they might be, education, or they might be the economic growth. And so the goal of these interagency councils is try to coordinate and to help implement policy despite all of those complexities. And one of the other things that you should know about the bureaucracy is that there is a need for administrative discretion. And so presidents are the head of the executive branch, and yet they can't micromanage 3 million people. And while they might be able to hold cabinet meetings, or they might be able to have the head of an agency come, and because they are appointed by the president, there is some, they serve at the pleasure of the president. The president might be able to simply just dismiss them. But at the same time, because they cannot be micromanaged, there has to be a level of administrative discretion that is given to the heads of the departments, to the heads of the agencies. And that oftentimes can create conflict between the president and the rest of the federal bureaucracy. You should know that, again, they have different, constituencies. They have kind of competing calendars. And so while the presidency might be thinking about getting elected, those, within the, different agencies are simply thinking about their policy domain. And so what is good for policy might not be actually good politically. And so the degree to which the president can actually oversee the entire federal bureaucracy is limited. And so that means that as president, although the president is the single most powerful person within that executive branch, there are certainly challenges for the president to be able to kind of implement that vision at the ground level. And so Congress makes laws, and then it is up to the federal bureaucracy to make the rules concerning those laws. And so what you might have is any sort of different numbers of inputs that might cause a rule to actually be drafted. And so we went through the legislative process, and here is a rulemaking process. And the good news is that it is actually much simpler. And so what happens is rules are going to be proposed. The Office of Management and Budget is going to do an evaluation, since all policies cost money, and we want to know what those might cost. Then you need to let the public know about what that rulemaking, what that rule proposal is. And so then they're going to post it in the Federal Register, in which people can actually publicly comment. So one of the time, public doesn't always comment on proposed rules, but you might remember a couple years ago when there was the proposed rule about ending and getting rid of net neutrality. And so the FCC has proposed that rule, and they post that rule into the Federal Register, and then all sorts of different interested groups, whether they are interest groups or private citizens, went and provided comments, and those comments are evaluated, and as in the case of net neutrality, largely ignored, and they proposed and they implement their actually final draft of the rule. It goes back to the Office of Management and Budget to kind of get a final check on cost, and then that rule is published in the Federal Register. So if you actually want to know where all the rules of the federal government are, you can go online and look at the Federal Register. Were you to print it out, you could stack it from the bottom of the ocean to the surface. So there are quite a number of rules in the Federal Register. One of my favorite classified spilled milk as an edible oil and therefore subject to EPA regulations. If you read the document from Wilson about federal bureaucracy, what it is and why it does it, I would highly recommend that you do if you have not. It talks a lot about why the federal bureaucracy works and operates the way that it does. And Wilson's thesis essentially is that it comes down to a difference of incentives. And so what things that you see is that the federal bureaucracy suffers from kind of certain pathologies, or there's certain problems with it that develop kind of over time. Now, I'd like to highlight that in any large organization, this is also true. These are not just unique to government. So, for example, you ask people who, let's say, work for Bank of America, and they'll talk about the same kind of pathologies that are there. And so they tend to be the byproduct of when organizations just become very large and they become kind of impersonal. And the first is red tape. So there's a lot of rules, and those rules all exist because we demand accountability from our government. They exist because we want things to be fair. They exist because we don't want corruption. They exist because something goes wrong and we create a rule to fix it. But oftentimes that means that there's so many different hoops that you must jump through to get things done. It tends to make government more and more inefficient. So, for example, just think about the process at school. If we wanted to create an AP social studies shirt and compare that to if you and a group of friends wanted a shirt. When you and your group of friends want a shirt, you design a shirt and you go on a website and you order it, and there you go, you have it in a few days. That's certainly not the case for school. We need to make sure that the words on that shirt are school appropriate. We need to make sure that students aren't going to be overcharged. We need to make sure that teachers aren't making money off of this. We need to make sure that there's not kind of collusion between the business that's printing it. That there is a fair process for bids, that the price is also fair. And so in the end, that just creates a lot of rules and regulations that to get through in order to get things in order to be fair. And sometimes there's so many rules, it's just not worth doing. One of the other things we see is conflict. There's two types of conflict here. There's conflict between agencies. There's conflict over policy domains, and there's conflict between the kind of presidency and the agencies themselves, given that they have administrative discretion. And so when we talk about kind of conflict between agencies, one of the things you'll see is that, again, there's not a single agency that's in charge of a policy. So for example, let's say your goal as a government is to kind of tackle the opioid crisis. And so the question then is, well, who's in charge of tackling this? Or again, if it's immigration, who's in charge of immigration? There's not a single entity that's in charge of these things. There's a lot of overlap, and therefore that creates, conflict. There's also then duplication in that because, because we put a lot of different agencies in charge, one of the goals is to make sure that there's going to actually be accountability to make sure that things don't fall through the cracks. But then at the same time, that creates a problem, because then when things fail, who do we hold accountable and who's actually in charge? Oftentimes there's also conflict in that certain, like the actions of certain agencies might conflict with the actions of other agencies. So for example, like we've got parts of the federal government that's looking to improve crop yields. And then we also have policies that pay farmers not to grow their crops. And so those policies themselves, while each of them have merits individually, when you put them together, they actually create conflict and conflicting goals. You also see imperialism, in that this is where Wilson talks about the incentives of the federal bureaucracy. And so there is a need, or there's in order to to grow. And so oftentimes agencies compete against each other in order to compete for resources. Resources are finite. Congress is always looking to cut costs. And so what happens is this creates an incentive for each of these agencies and departments to protect their own at the expense of others. And that might not actually be good policy. So you might be promoting, for example, some weapons program or weapons system, and your incentive is to keep that alive and to grow that. And so you overstate the benefits, you understate the costs. You also then are incentivized to grow, because again, if you get cut, then people are going to lose their jobs. And so therefore your accountability oftentimes is to your own department, to the employees that are under you, the people that are looking to you, and that might be different than what is actually good for the country as a whole. And so there's certainly an incentive for each of these agencies in order to grow, and to grow even at the expense of others. And lastly, that is waste. Like because of red tape and conflict and duplication and imperialism, we do tend to have waste. And a big part of this is also the incentives. There's not a lot of incentives necessarily, to save. So for example, like as a teacher, there's no incentive for me to, let's say, save copy paper. And so because I don't have that incentive, I might not then act in a way that might save copy paper. The same is with kind of the federal bureaucracy at large. And Congress operates according to a 2-year budget cycle. And so if you do not spend your money within those 2 years, Congress will look at that and say like, hey, you got too much money and we will cut it. And so there is an incentive to spend all of the money that Congress allocates to you. And in fact, try to spend more, which, and ask for more, and that way you can grow. And that's where that imperialism, comes in. And so when you look at reforming the bureaucracy, one of the things that we really should look at is how do we actually change the incentives of the federal bureaucracy. The problem with that is actually very difficult to do, and it's not always clear how that can be done. So for example, like we all agree that we should have a better education system. So that means we should increase accountability for teachers. We should increase accountability for students. We should raise our standards. The question though is how to actually do that. And so, for example, like let's start paying teachers based upon student performance. Well, that's fine on the surface, but that creates all sorts of problems and an incentive structure. And so now suddenly I'm incentivized to get you good scores. That's great. But that might mean like maybe I will cut corners, or maybe I will do things in a way that doesn't actually improve your learning. It just actually improves your scores. Or there might be differences kind of socioeconomically, like that, or policy like that might be great for someone like me, and not so great for someone who teaches at a Title I kind of inner city school. And so, again, we all agree that we would like to kind of increase our accountability of government and our standards, but how to actually do that and implement that in a way that is effective and fair is not always clear. Part of the accountability of the bureaucracy itself is that through like different regulations. The Penalty and Civil Service Act is already mentioned, and the spoils system. The Hatch Act tries to regulate what federal employees can and cannot do in order to influence elections. And so one of the things that you don't want is the people that are very, in charge of regulating kind of certain policies to be the ones that are actually influencing elections. So you don't necessarily want someone from like, the EPA trying to influence the voting public for, to get certain people in Congress who are going to be regulating them to win, and other people, to be defeated. We've liberalized the Hatch Act in the 1990s. Members of the federal bureaucracy can donate to political campaigns, but they can still not kind of actively campaign for different people. The problem with the Hatch Act, though, is that it's just really not that enforced. In fact, people are all the time complaining about members of the federal executive branch violating the Hatch Act without really much accountability. And then there's also accountability through the relationship between the three branches. And so the federal bureaucracy is largely part of the executive branch. Congress is the one that funds them. Congress has oversight over them. Congress can issue subpoenas. Congress can, force them into, to testify. Congress can use the court system in order to ensure that the bureaucracy is actually enforcing those laws. And the presidency themselves can actually kind of dismiss people and use that power of kind of appointment and dismissal as well. And so, as you can see here, again, we kind of covered most of these. So again, comes down to executive orders would be another way in which the president can influence the federal bureaucracy. Again, Congress can pass laws. Congress can investigate. Congress uses the power of the purse, and then the judiciary is the one that actually can rule on the legality and constitutionality. And then lastly, again, part of oversight is, as already mentioned, that Congress has subpoena power. They can force members of the bureaucracy to come and to testify under oath. They're the ones that created all of these agencies. They can abolish them. They can, again, use the power of the purse in order to decide whether or not they are going to fund and allocate money and resources to the federal bureaucracy. And so, as a quick review, the federal bureaucracy is the part of the executive branch that implements policies. It is the largest part of the federal government. It is not directly accountable to the people. They are largely hired through the Office of Personnel Management or the Senior Executive Service. And there is accountability to every branch of government. So there's accountability to the president, to Congress, and to the judiciary. There is also then there is also the conflict between each of those, and because of administrative discretion, each of those other three branches might have some challenges in that oversight and holding the federal bureaucracy accountable. All right, again, if you have any questions about the federal bureaucracy, feel free to let me know. Hopefully this was helpful.